welcome everybody. Another episode of Legend Sports and Amplify. We're talking baseball history, Negro League history, card art, music, collecting, whatever your passion is for baseball, baseball history, the Negro Leagues. I am really, really happy to have on this afternoon. She's an award-winning children's book author, written some 24 books on various topics, many of them baseball related. But her new book coming out this January on Larry Doby. Audrey Vernick. How are you, Audrey?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. We were talking a little bit before we got on here why I'm doing these, trying to raise awareness and to various topics. Most of them centered around the Negro Leagues, but other things as well. And your books, because my wife being a teacher, and I've always had this thing about kids need to have something interesting, something that they're reading, something that grabs their attention, so that they learn about history and various other topics that have come up. And I've had on several other children's books authors, and your books are fascinating. I mean, you've done so many very, very cool topics. The F. Manley book, which we'll talk about, the upcoming Larry Doby book, several others. And
Yep.
I always find it interesting how you got to where you are today, because you've got various topics, not just baseball, and we
Right.
talked a little bit about how you got into the baseball, but if you walk us through how you got into being a children's author and where you are today in your career.
There's about 1,700 reasons, but I will just take the three that thread together the most. Um, as a young reader, as a young child, I started reading young, and I had a connection to books that a lot of people have, but not everyone has. I think I
Mhm.
still look back on the books that I read as a child as though they were my friends. I remember them. I remember the parts I loved to read over and over.
Mhm.
So that has to be part of it. Like I can't say, and on that day I knew that I'd be a writer, because there was nothing like that. But I know that love for the books I loved most has to have something to do with it.
Mhm.
In terms of, I was writing literary fiction for adults. I was publishing in, obscure journals and magazines. And you might not know this, but the way you are paid for that kind of writing is they send you copies of the magazine. And it's very hard to pay for your groceries with copies of obscure literary magazines. So
Mhm.
I mean, no one goes into children's writing for the money. That there is
Mhm.
some money, but you're not raking it in. But the idea of continuing to write for copies of magazines started to get a
Right.
little old as I started to get a little old. Around that time, I so clearly remember I came across an artist's work online. He's a folk artist, an outsider artist from Mississippi. And I just had that kind of reaction we sometimes have, where I was just like, I know that, I love that, I need to like immerse myself in that. The artist's name was Tim Brown. I have two sisters. I remember showing the art to one of my sisters, and she said, that would be such a good illustration in a children's book. Boom. That's a moment I can point at and say,
Right.
oh, look, that's when it started, because she and I got permission to write his story. His name's Tim Brown, like I said, and focused on his relationship with his childhood dog. I'm a kind of dog person. And eventually, after 27 rejections, we published a book called Bark and Tim, A True Story of Friendship. And that was my first children's book. And then, so that came out in 2003. And then there's this hideously long learning curve that happened for many, many years. And then starting in 2010, I've been publishing regularly. But from 2003, where I sort of snuck this book in when I maybe wasn't ready as a writer to do that, and then had these years to learn. So in that ensuing time, I was also raising my children. And when my son was in fifth grade, he came home with did you have Weekly Reader when you were growing up?
Yes.
So he came home with one of the many different versions they have of that now, which is Time for Kids. And I'm sure he brought it home all the time, but only once did I ever pluck it out of his backpack, open it up, and see a little article this big, maybe 5 sentences about someone named Effa Manley. And it said she was going to be the first woman in the Hall of Fame. And I was like, all right, hang on. It says she owned a team in New Jersey. I live in New Jersey. I thought I knew a lot about baseball history. And here was this woman being honored for her role in its history and civil rights history. And I'd never heard her name before. So, it was, you could go online and say, like, I really thought that Time for Kids had it wrong and that I knew everything. But I went and said,
Awesome.
oh, no, no, this is real. Okay. And I also was wholly convinced that every person had decided, I'm going to write a children's book about this woman. So I felt like I was in this
Really?
enormous race to, I wasn't, nobody else was, I don't think anybody else was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But so I had to teach myself how to do that kind of research because Bark and Tim, it was more of a, we just talk, through letters we wrote to the artist back and forth. Effa was no longer alive when I
Mm-hmm.
heard about it. Her husband was no longer alive. They didn't have kids. I didn't get response when I wrote to her niece. And so I reached out to the Hall of Fame and they had their research library. Right now you can access so much more from home than you could back then.
Mm-hmm.
This was maybe 2006, something like that. So I made my first trip to Cooperstown and I had this baseball loving husband and this baseball loving son who didn't come with me. So I didn't let myself do the museum. I sort of walked like this into the library because I felt like I couldn't
Ah.
experience the museum without them.
Mm-hmm.
And they pulled out the files. I mean, Effa Manley kept this scrapbook and she put
Wow.
everything, all these newspaper articles in it and like cards she received. And she even wrote it in her own hand, like this was the proudest day of my life and I owe all of the accolades to Abe, her husband, Abe Manley. And wow, so it was just so heady and you had to put on the white gloves before they'd let you touch their stuff. And I thought I had a story, except I knew in my heart I didn't have a story yet, because think about when you're a young reader, you don't want to be reading this adult did this adult thing on this day. There was nothing about her childhood. There was Effa
Wow.
Manley was born. When she was 18, she moved to New York, and there was nothing I could find in between. And I said, I can't make it up. I knew that much, and I
Mm-hmm.
can't find it. And so I just kind of tried to figure it out and failed and called the Hall of Fame one more time and said, are you sure there's nothing else? And they found a tape. They found a recording of an
Oh, wow.
interview she gave, which they let me listen to. So crazy to hear her voice like that. And she
Mm-hmm.
sounded just like my grandmother. And she told this story
Unbelievable.
about something that happened to her in first grade. And it was horrible what happened to her in first grade. So the thing that had to be kind of tenderly handled in a children's book is it is said that Effa Manley is the child of her white mother and not the black man she thought to be her father, but the mother's white employer. So she is believed to, she said later in life that her mother told her this when she was old, when she was maybe 18 or older, that this man who you've always thought of your father, this black man, is not your father. Your father, biological father, was my employer, and he was white, and I'm white, so you're white. She had been raised with her black sibling. She'd been raised as black. She was completely convinced she had no reason to think she wasn't. So the scene that happens that she mentioned in this interview is she was
Wow.
literally sent to the principal's office for playing with her brothers and sisters in the schoolyard. Why are you playing with those black children, with those Negro children?
Wow.
Is what they said to her. They were her siblings. So I felt like not only is that something from her childhood, but that's
Mm-hmm.
the book. I mean, that's like, it made no sense to her then. And that kind of racism made no sense to her whole way through her life. And she affected change. I mean, I found her story so inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I assumed everyone in the world did too, and that they were all writing their own book as well. But I just really couldn't wait to share this story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, children's books have pretty short lives. If they don't sell well in a store in the first 3 months, they're not going to get much more space in a store. They'll live in libraries and they'll live in school libraries and classrooms sometimes, but they're not going to live in a store. And it didn't live in a store well, but it's still in print. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm really heartened by
Cool.
that because my first contract with a big publishing house,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought Don Tate's illustrations were really something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also where I met Larry Doby. Like I knew of Larry Doby by name. I didn't really
Mm-hmm.
know. And there's this big illustration of him in the book And She Loved Baseball of him hitting a home run. Side note that people wouldn't know if they didn't know me. That picture had to be flipped because the illustrator had him. I think was he a lefty? I think he
He
was
was
right.
left-handed, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, the home run was right-handed, and the illustrator's like a brilliant illustrator, but not a baseball guy. And I
Mm-hmm.
guess
Mm-hmm.
didn't really think through. So my
Mm-hmm.
brother-in-law, a violinist, caught it, and they were able to flip the picture right before the book came out, because that's the kind of thing that makes baseball reviewers irate. Like if you have
Sure.
that with good reason. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that was the last minute save for that book. But yeah, that's how that one
Awesome.
came to be.
Awesome. Boy, you make a great point, and that's exactly why I'm trying to have these conversations with as many anybody who'll talk to me about it, and if I can put it out there, because you just said about the stories, right? Um, these people didn't just spring out of the earth, right? Effa Manley didn't spring out of the earth one day and become, a Hall of Fame first female owner, only female in the Hall of Fame. She had a life, and she had things that she went through and things she overcame and things that she may have been interested in, a whole life just like everybody else, just like any of
Right.
these players have. And unfortunately, though, not a lot of the stories, particularly of the Negro Leagues and black baseball history, have been told, and if they have been being told, it's to not that wide of an audience. So hopefully this past year, things have started to change. Now that Major League Baseball is recognized, right? I mean,
Right.
they were always Major League They were always Major
Of
Leagues,
course.
and only playing there because of the racist policies of the day, and they were forced to, but they overcame, and they did what they had to do. But there are lots of stories, dozens, hundreds, thousands of stories
Yeah.
that need to be told, and I hope by these recent announcements and statistics are going to be worked in there. Lots of people, many people have done the work of digging and
Yeah.
researching. Like you said, there's people who've been digging into box scores and old newspaper archives of, trying to find the background on these players to give credence. Because, for the last 20, 30 years that I've known, many people that I know, they've kind of pushed back on how good these guys may have been, and called them things like AAA talent at best and things like that, and
Yeah.
it's just absurd. But anyway, I'm really happy that you and others are telling these stories, certainly to the next audience, because the younger audience, because the
Yeah.
next generations have to hear these kinds of stories. And so let me ask you a question. So you talked about that episode in that I never knew about with Effa Manley. Is there any topics that because I've had these conversations with Jonah Winter, as I mentioned, and he touches on a lot of topics that sometimes are, I don't want to say they're third rail, but they're a little, they're
Yeah.
things that you don't necessarily always see people talking about because sometimes they could be a little controversial. Have you run across? How do you approach that? How do you handle that?
So carefully, because I'm going to give you an example with Effa Manley. I knew this. I didn't think it was appropriate for a children's book. The question about who was her father, and so I wrote a true sentence that sort of dealt with it. It said, Effa was light skinned like her mother. Her siblings were dark like their father. It's
Mm-hmm.
true. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't go anywhere near the part that just doesn't have a place in a children's book.
Mm-hmm.
And the other tricky thing, I think what I find trickiest about writing for young audiences is I can tell you a story and I don't need to provide the historical context. I
Mm-hmm.
don't need to talk about where racism came from, and I
Mm-hmm.
mean, and how far back it goes,
Mm-hmm.
and how much do you put in there,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think kids are pretty familiar with segregation more than they are with systemic racism, and so
Mm-hmm.
provide some of those examples. They couldn't do this, they couldn't do that, but it's a fine line, and I think you
Mm-hmm.
just find the line in the writing. Like I don't know if I don't have a game plan going in. I just know I'm not going to say what doesn't need to be said in this book. I'm going to give as much of the important information as I can while walking this very tricky line.
Mm-hmm. I think, and I mentioned this to you before we started, I appreciate you guys writing these children's books for the reasons I already mentioned, but also the fact that it's not that easy. I mean, I don't know what people think. I mean, you look at a novel that could be 500 pages or more for a novel, can get wordy, you can describe all sorts of things. With a children's book, you've got to take a limited number of points that you want to try to get into the book
Yeah.
and pare that down into a language and a number of words for a limited number of books. That can't be easy, right?
Every time I look at She Loved Baseball, I'm sick about the one left on the cutting room floor, which
Oh.
is when she marched up to Branch Rickey and gave him a piece of her mind. It was just this very public upbraiding of every account you read about it had him described as a different red color when she was done with him. There was scarlet, crimson, it was just, everybody was just, and it just, you have to make the choices, and
Hmm.
I do a lot of school visits to elementary schools, and I don't have the number memorized, but I write the number of days Effa Manley lived, and obviously it's a big number.
Hmm.
And I say, just like in your life, something happened every day of Effa Manley's life. We
Hmm.
never have a day where nothing matters. The thing you need to know when you're reading a book is that an author made a choice about which things to include and which things not to include. You don't really know all the important things. You know all the things that that author thought were important, and that's
Hmm.
why you need many books about a person to really get to know the full idea of them. Because every time I look at that cover, all I see is what would have been the illustration of her marching up to Brent Tricky and giving it to him. And
Awesome.
and everyone's like, "But Brent Tricky's such a hero," and I'm like, "You're not to her, not so much to her."
So you've got a number of baseball books out of your. I mean, roughly, like I said, it's about 2 dozen books that you have written so far. And you've picked out some topics that are near and dear to me because not only the Negro Leagues, but the you got a book on Max Patkin. I don't know
I
how many
do
people.
indeed.
Oh man, I don't know how many people even know who Max Patkin is. But the Clown Prince of Baseball. I mean, I was seeing him when I was a kid. I don't know if people
Did
realize
you
he.
see him?
Yes, and he used to come when I was working for the Red Barons. We would have him at least once or twice a year. He would come and do his shtick, with his cat sideways and the goofy, the floppy. He just was a character, and the faces that he made. People don't realize he also played. He was a
Oh yeah,
player.
he just got injured.
Yeah,
He suffered too many injuries in the
yeah. He
Navy,
wasn't.
but
He
he
had
was no
a
slouch.
he had an interesting life and career, and people think of him as a kind of he was the clown prince of baseball. But I just thought it was a great. I mean, it was awesome that you have a book about Max Patkin. I don't know how many books about Max Patkin are even
Not
out
too
there.
many, but
I
what I
wouldn't
really
think.
liked about it is, there's all those, like, I would say children, but they're boys, young boys who dream of that life in baseball. And I liked showing, like, it's not always, I mean, he would said himself, like,
Hmm.
it wasn't the life he imagined in baseball, but he had a streak longer than Cal Ripken's of not missing a single game,
Hmm.
going town to town to town, sometimes in a mail truck,
Hmm.
however he could get there.
Hmm.
And that the lives in baseball don't always have to be as a major league player.
No, and it's interesting you said about that type of a life because when I first started learning about the Negro Leagues, and everybody I think has a cursory high level. You know who Satchel Paige maybe was, Josh
Right.
Gibson, the Kansas City Monarchs. But then when I really in the early '90s when I met some of these players who were still alive at the time is when I really was like, wow. But I also remember in the 1970s the Indianapolis Clowns. Well, they were the Clowns. I don't know if they were Indianapolis, but they were the Clowns. They were still barnstorming. They were still touring. They came to
Yep.
Scranton, Pennsylvania. They played at Shout
Wow.
Stadium in Dunmore, and my dad took me to go see them. That was when the King and His Court is another one of those touring. You know who he was? Eddie Feiner. He was
I don't think so.
Eddie Feiner was another legendary baseball player, but went into softball, and he I don't want to get too much into Eddie Feiner, but he was called the King in his court, and he used to tour around. But the Clowns came, and so a lot of people used to think that that was kind of the that was what the Negro Leagues were. I think
Right.
it left this indelible mark in people's brains that the Negro Leagues were just a clown vaudeville act kind of thing, and
Right.
no, that's kind of maybe what they became, kind of like what Max Patkin
Right.
kind of had to evolve into in order
Right.
to
It's
make a
interesting.
living.
Yeah.
These guys were making a living. That's really
Yeah.
what it came down to with the barnstorming. Tell us about, you've got another book out here, the Acera family,
It's
uh,
pronounced Achera, even though it's
Acera.
spelled Acera.
So tell
So
us a little bit about them because I thought this story, I had never heard this
this
in my
story,
life.
this is one from my heart. So
Yeah,
here's another one. So this story took place maybe like 8 miles from where I live in New Jersey. They were a family from Long Branch. But the craziest thing
really?
is,
Okay, cool.
one, 3 doors down from me, there's a tiny little street, Achera Road. And it's been there for 20 years before I ever knew this story, named after one of the Achera brothers. And
Wow.
it's 2 doors down. And I was just like, my stories just kept sort of surrounding me until I got them.
There you
So the
go.
way this story came to be, I had a baseball playing son. He had a coach who was Rob Achera. Rob Achera would talk, and Rob's son played as well. Rob's father was one of the 12 baseball playing Achera brothers of Long Branch.
Amazing.
a family of 16 children. There had been 18 individual live births by this mom. Now I'm under 5 feet, and I'm told she was smaller than me, Mama
18.
Achera.
Oh
18
my.
live
Oh
births.
my goodness gracious.
And the Achera brothers were very good. And they, at that time, there was a lot of like league play and what did they call it then? Semi-pro, right?
Mm-hmm.
Semi-pro baseball. So they were paid, but they were barely paid,
Mm.
and they were remarkable. And some of them tried out for major league
Wow.
teams, but they never left because no one wanted to break up the family team. The only time the family team broke up was during World War II, when six of the 12 brothers enlisted, and all six came home. And they started
Wow.
playing again when they returned. So Rob would always talk about his this incredible thing. And I was always like, does Rob know how many guys you need for a baseball team? Because he's claiming it was an all brother team, but how are there 9 brothers? And there were 12. And so
12.
by the time the story came to my level of hearing about it and thinking about it, only 3 of those brothers were still alive.
Oh my goodness gracious.
And oh my, were they something? They're no longer
Uh,
alive now. But I am not.
ay, ay, ay.
I'm not comfortable just putting myself out in the world and plopping
Mm-hmm.
myself in someone's life. So,
Mm-hmm.
some if I have to call someone who's around my age, I'll say, "Hey, would you like to meet at Starbucks or something?" In a pre-pandemic world,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think you called up an 80-year-old guy and said, "Do you want to meet at Starbucks?" you know, and
Uh-huh.
you didn't, and so I kind of had to work up my courage, but I did, and I called and I said, explained my connection because I wasn't a total stranger. I knew his nephew, and I explained that I wrote for children. And I said, I just want to ask you some questions. If you'd be interested, I'd love to try to write a book about this. And he said, yeah, all right. So, we have spaghetti on Tuesday. So come on Tuesday. And I was like, oh, no, no, no. I'm not coming for dinner. I thank you, but no, let me just come. He
Oh
said, okay,
my.
so we'll see you 5 o'clock for spaghetti on Tuesday. So I went at 5 o'clock for spaghetti on Tuesday. And
That is
I
awesome.
learned that every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, every week of the year, he would wake up early and start cooking as though there was going to be a big party at his house. He didn't know who would be there, but people showed up, people who he worked with, people his brothers worked with, all these widowed men, largely, who didn't have anyone cook. Freddie knew how to cook, but a lot of men of that generation didn't know how to
Unbelievable.
cook. Spaghetti on Tuesdays, meatloaf on Thursdays. I can't for the life of me remember what Wednesdays was.
Mm-hmm.
But I showed up more than one Tuesday because, when you ask your questions, you get home and look at what you've got. You go, why didn't you ask that? And they weren't guys who were going to answer my emails or talk to me on the phone. You had to sort of show up on the Tuesday for spaghetti or Thursday for meatloaf.
Wow.
And you'd put the tape recorder in the middle of the table. And oh my goodness, you had to keep saying, it's a children's book, because they were saying all these
Yeah.
crazy testosterone stories, like remember the time dad beat up the other coach? Like, not that story. No, not that story. Remember when I was in the
Oh
Navy
my
and I borrowed some
goodness.
guy's ID to take he took the swimming test for me because I couldn't swim. And I was like, but you were in the Navy on a ship? And he's like, yeah, yeah. And I was like, a children's book. We don't put this, like that might be true, but we're not putting that out there because, you're always
Unbelievable.
narrowing to get the story you're going to tell.
Yeah.
So it is the
I got to
truth
read
that
it.
they
I
were.
have to. I have to read this book. I got to get it
They
and
were
read it.
honored by the Hall of Fame as the longest playing all brother baseball team. The Hall of Fame had a file they provided to me of all the all
Unbelievable.
brother baseball teams, 29 others. The Acheras
Wow.
would tell you, yeah, they used cousins, or like that one, they used neighbors. They weren't all brothers.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it was something. It was an
Is that?
amazing thing to be part of.
I got to assume. I grew up in a town. Is that an Italian background? Is that
Yeah.
Italian?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But you said spaghetti. I grew up. There were in Old Forge, Pennsylvania. It's the pizza capital of the world. It's not for Okay, you are literally probably 2 hours, an hour and a half from the pizza capital of the world. Did you know that?
Yeah, but I think New York is the pizza capital of the
Well,
world.
Google pizza capital of the world,
Okay.
and you're going to get Old Forge, Pennsylvania, and it's a Sicilian pizza square. It's fantastic. It really is
All right.
really really good. But I grew up in this town. It was 7,000 people. 6,995 Italians, and my family. That was pretty much maybe not quite that extreme, but
Yeah, no, I get
mostly
it.
Italians, and that's how it was in Northeast PA. You know what it's like in the Northeast.
Yes, of course.
You drive down the main street, and it's the same main street, but it's Main, South Main, Main Avenue, North Main.
Right.
But it goes through 25 towns, and each one has got its own little ethnic
Right.
roots. You know,
Right.
the Polish town is Dixon City, and the Irish are in Scranton, and the Italians were at Old Forge, and so forth.
Yeah.
And I love, I kind of, I miss that. Being, I'm down here in Texas now. I kind of miss
It's different.
that.
Houston's different for
It's
sure.
it's different. But are you familiar? There's a whole yeah, that book, they'd probably love to hear about it. There's an Italian American Baseball Federation that is
They
out
were
there.
honored in their Hall of Fame.
They are in there. Okay,
Yeah.
I got to talk
My
to.
publisher donated books for the ceremony.
Awesome. I got to have.
Yeah.
They just had their banquet just the other
Yeah,
day.
that's where they were honored, obviously posthumously, but some of the I
At this
believe Rob was one of the people who went.
at this one that was just like last week.
No, 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 no. It
Okay,
was maybe
okay.
like 3 or 4 years ago.
I
Yeah.
have to tell. There's an author, a guy I really like his work, and he lives in. He moved back to New Jersey from California. Rocco Constantino. If that's not an Italian name, I don't know what is.
Yeah,
Right?
really.
But he wrote a book on several books he's authored, and he's a coach, he's a baseball coach. But he's part of this Italian American baseball. They were just I'm gonna have to tell him
Oh,
about.
nice.
I'm gonna have to tell him about this because I think it's fascinating. It really really is.
Oh, it's one of my it was a very hard one to find a publisher for, and
Really,
in
that
hindsight,
is a great
it's
story.
the one that sold the most copies.
Yeah, I was going to get to that. What out of you've written besides the baseball books that we've talked about some of them so far, but you've written about a lot of things that as a now I like I said I've got one in the Navy, but I've also got a pre-K. What it's like to be in second grade and learning how to tell time and all kinds of other things. I think they're all great. What made you do some of these other books? I mean, there's a lot of
Each
interesting
one has its own
topics.
story,
I bet.
I think like there's one called First Grade Dropout,
Yeah.
and when people were asking me why I wrote it, I stumbled and I wasn't sure, and then I realized it took me so long to get it, but it was because of how keenly I felt the awfulness of being embarrassed as a young child. I
Ah.
just like I remember the rawness, and it just hit me as pain to be embarrassed when I was a kid. And this is about a kid who accidentally in front of the whole class calls his teacher mommy, which happens all the time. But the whole class cracks up, and it's just he's like, "Well, that's it. I'm done. I can't go back to school. Quite obviously, I called the teacher mommy. Everyone laughed. I'm done." And so that one, almost every book I've written has like an answer like that. Like, why'd you write this one? Oh, because I was just deeply embarrassed as a child. And a lot of them are unlikely friendship stories. I
Uh-huh.
like a story about an unlikely friendship. And some of them, no, really just one of them. There's one called Bogart and Vinny. Do you remember when there was like maybe a 2 year period when every children's book seemed to be about an interspecies friendship, and they were, and I as a reader and they were true. They were like, yes, this horse is in love with this elephant, and I was like, they don't talk. How do you know that? What are you talking about? They're in love. And so I wrote a book in which a rhinoceros and a dog are presumed to be best friends, and the rhinoceros despises the dog. He wants to be left alone so bad, and the reader knows that, and the rhinoceros knows that, but everyone else in the book is like, oh, an interspecies friendship, how wonderful, like that.
I just put up your
To
website.
play.
I just put up your website. Well, we'll keep talking here. I just wanted people to
Okay,
see
good.
some of these books. AudreyVernick.com. I'm on your book page and just scrolling down so people can see 5 minutes. That's a lot of time. I thought was very, very cool. There's the Max Patkin book, second grade. You got a first grade dropout, second grade holdout.
Sequel.
The
That one had a sequel.
Awesome.
There's also this one. This is a novel, Screaming at the Ump.
I see that. Yeah, yeah. I just
Yeah.
pulled that up. Yeah.
It was so there was the year, I think it might have been 2011. I think it might have been 2011. Do you remember the year when in the postseason umps made
Ah,
all those mistakes and it changed the
yeah,
outcome of games? And
yeah.
everyone was talking about it in the postseason. And like kids don't even understand that now because they're like, why don't you just do an instant replay? And I'm like, well, you couldn't then. You weren't allowed to do that then. And so I just like was always like, well, how do you even become an umpire? And I learned that there are the umpire schools and that every umpire is a graduate of the umpire schools. And then that fact went and lived in my head for like
Awesome.
maybe 3 years. And then I was just looking for a subject for my next novel. And I was like, oh, I should make one of those umpire schools in New Jersey and write about a family that runs an umpire school. And
Cool.
and because my imagination
But
let me down, I tried, I'd read books, I'd watched video, but I couldn't get the sort of nuts and bolts of umpire school. I couldn't feel the day to day. So I wrote to one that's not in business anymore and asked if I could come observe for a few days. And they let me, and
Nice.
it was fantastic.
I bet. I
It
bet.
was fantastic.
So a fictional yet realistic look at the world of umpiring.
I'm
Very
not sure
fun.
how realistic it is, but I
I'm
use
sure it
my
is.
imagination a lot. But it was
Very, very cool.
based on observation.
Very, very cool. And then I put something out on Twitter, but when I came across this book that you did, I've been focusing this last week because it was coming up on the Hall of Fame. Trying to put out some things that had to do with. Every day I try to put out something on Twitter that
Hmm.
I'm hoping people, kind of like what we're talking about, gets them to look around, think about it, kind of thing. Something that they're not going to see every day in the news, and the Edith Houghton story to me is amazing. I mean, I can't even believe. How did you come across? Now you've got you told me. I'm gonna go flip you back on here. You have your International Women's Baseball
Well, I
conference
mean, there's
shirt
some
on.
women I know through there, and I let it be known that I was going to try to write this book. And people said to me, "Well, good luck," because I've heard a lot of people say that before. And to me, I was like, "Oh, bring it on!" Like that was
uh,
like the ultimate throwdown. And I was like, "Well, now I'm definitely going to do it." But I knew what they meant
boy.
because there was, again, you were limited by the information available, right?
Hmm.
And there was some great information available. I mean, she
Oh my
literally
goodness
lived
gracious.
across the street from a park, and she would just sit in her window and watch the men play baseball across the street till bedtime under the lights.
Hmm.
And she was the youngest of, I think, 11, and all the boys played baseball. And she said she was born with a baseball in her hand, and she was just this phenom. And
Hmm.
when I tell this story, when I'm visiting schools, I say, okay, so she heard about tryouts for an all women's team. She's 10 years old. She's not a woman, she's a child. But she hears about tryouts for an all women's team. She packs her equipment bag. She walks 2 miles by herself through Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. She finds the manager, somehow convinces a manager of a women's team to let her try out. She's so good, she not only makes the team, she's their starting shortstop. She's playing professional baseball at the age of 10.
Unbelievable.
What? And the
Yeah.
papers all referred to her as the kid, and that's where the title. And she literally grew up on Diamond Street, which is so nice when you're writing a
Really, right?
baseball
Baseball. What?
biography.
I'm reading all that, and I did catch that Diamond Street. I'm thinking, wait a minute, really, for real? I mean, you
I
couldn't even
know.
plan. She's like the female, like it's like Benjamin Button, or what was the what was everything about it? You read it and you go, what? I mean, it seems
What?
so fantastical that.
And then when the team was going to Japan, which of course meant taking a train across the country and going on a boat,
Hmm.
her mom said, "Okay,
Crazy.
you can go by yourself to Japan with your
It's
team when you're 13. You
it's
can drop
unbelievable.
out of school and do that." What?
But then to go on, oh, my dog is barking. But then to go on from there, sorry.
My dog's going to chime in, I promise.
Uh-huh. But then to go on from there to be involved in World War II, boy, oh boy, Peanut.
I like the sound of a barking dog.
Yeah, she's a beagle, so you get that beagle howl every once in a while, when every time the wind blows usually. But but anyway, the story then from there it gets. I mean, besides the baseball, to go on and become a scout for the Philadelphia Phillies, are you kidding me? I mean,
Yeah.
how that doesn't even seem real. And then her involvement in the military all the way through World War II,
Yeah.
Korea, Vietnam. It's just an incredible story. I
She's
am
something.
I'm
And
I'm amazed.
it was another case where I got to listen to a tape of an interview with her. By the time I came along, she was 90, she was 99, I think. She wasn't
Oh,
doing interviews anymore.
she just
So,
passed
but there was
away,
a
right?
lot
Not
that,
that long ago, a decade or
yeah, she
so
passed
ago,
away
right?
shortly before the book came out.
Hmm.
But she remarkable, just like a once in a lifetime player, I think,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
10 years old. She was playing professional baseball.
I can't.
Same.
I can't fathom that. It's just an incredible story that I thanks for writing the book because otherwise I never would I mean I never would have known.
Yeah.
At some point maybe you step on these things occasionally if you're digging, but because I never know. I kind of like I have lots of worksheets, spreadsheets, notes, things that I've decades that I've taken things. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just open up something that I haven't looked at in a while and see what I had and oh, okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. And I'll put that out there, right? Just
Right.
because to me it's interesting. I hope other people find it
Yeah.
interesting,
Right.
you know. So the Larry Doby book you've got is coming out in just a few more weeks, right? It's going to
Yeah.
be published the first week of January, and that's called Larry Doby All Star, right? Is that correct?
Yep.
What's the full title on the book?
I can never say it right, but I believe it is Larry Doby. No, All Star, how Larry Doby
Smash
smashed
the
the color
color barrier.
barrier in
Okay.
baseball.
Okay. Yeah, I've got you sent me. That was thank you for sending me that
Oh, my
file.
pleasure.
It was awesome to read. I love to see that type of to see kind of I don't want to say a peek behind the curtain, but to get to see things from that perspective is really interesting because I enjoy writing. I love to read. I've been reading. I can never read enough, honestly. But the theme that keeps going through this book, which I thought was really interesting, you repeat it every couple of pages, was that about change, about the world has to change, and then the world is
Right.
starting to change, and
Right.
I just thought it was very, very cool. How was that? That was the theme of his life that you thought was what you wanted to emphasize?
Kind of. And also the issue we talked about, I can't remember if it was before we started talking on here or if we talked before, but this idea of providing context for young readers,
Mm-hmm.
where I start the book by trying to explain that it never occurred to him that he could be a major league player, that he didn't see that as a door, that he saw it as a wall, that it
Mm-hmm.
was not, he didn't dream of it because it wasn't possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so for that to become a possibility, the world really would have to change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at each step, like, there's incremental change. And, he felt the change. He was still in the Navy when he heard what was happening with Jackie Robinson back home in the States. And like he felt that, he could feel the change then because he'd been playing for the Newark Eagles with, playing for Effa Manley's team. But he's like, all right, then, like that, there it is. It's a door now. It's something
Mm-hmm.
that someone can walk through. And,
Mm-hmm.
I show a picture of Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby together when I visit schools. And I say, does anyone know who either of these men is? And in almost every school, someone, lots of kids know who Jackie Robinson is. And the guesses are very funny about who Larry Doby is. Like, it could be everything from like Robinson Cano, which time wise, you just look and like, is it his brother? And like, no. And, I visit a lot of schools and I show the picture a lot of times. One person, a gym teacher at a school,
No.
knew it. Like his story's just not that, baseball people know him. I'm not sure they'd know him by sight if they didn't watch him play. And, it was 11 and a half weeks later, like nothing had changed. He was the first one in the American League. So
Mm-hmm.
again, just like Jackie was, he was the people's first black teammate, the people's first black opponent, the first time they'd seen a black man play on the field.
Mm-hmm.
There was no interleague play, right? It was, you're seeing an American League team, you're seeing a black man for the first exact same thing without the hot spotlight on it.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie got the big spotlight. And I think he would say he didn't want it, probably,
Mm-hmm.
right? He would have said, like, I'd have rather been him without the spotlight. But
Mm-hmm.
he went through the same hard garbage that
Mm-hmm.
Jackie went through. And we're not walking around knowing his name as much. And,
Mm-hmm.
I do hope that this can make that change a little bit.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, right, that what you just said, because there's kind of pros and cons with that, right? He came after Jackie, so that's a kind of a plus. Like you said, the spotlight tended to be on Jackie Robinson more so than on him. However, Jackie had a year of
Exactly.
build up to
Yeah,
that, and
absolutely.
he did not. So he
No,
was kind
I
of
know. And that was a
dropped right
point
into
that
the grease there,
I tried to make that point, and like it was another contextual thing where you'd have to sort of explain what a year in the minors can do for you, and there's just no room for that
Yeah.
in the book. But it hit home with me for sure. Like
Mm-hmm.
that, okay, your time, boink, right there.
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it
and
was
playing a position, everything about it was change for him. That while it was good, it had to be very, very difficult and very, very frustrating for him, and to be all by yourself. I mean,
oh
now,
my gosh,
I had on Luke Epling about a month and a half ago or so. He has a book out this year on the 1948 season, where he focuses on that kind of interaction between Satchel Paige, Bob Feller, Larry Doby, and Bill Veeck, and it's kind of interesting. It's a fascinating book, and
sure,
and yet I don't think that there's really a way to like you said, illustrate how important what Larry Doby did was, and it was just
yeah,
as important and often overlooked to some degree from what Jackie Robinson did. So, yeah, fascinating stuff. So you got this one coming out. What's next? What do you got? What do you got cooking?
I don't know. In addition to writing, I co-write a lot. So,
Oh, okay.
the book you were looking at, like 5 minutes, is a lot of time. No, it's not. Yes, it is. That's co-written book, and I have two more co-written books coming out after
Oh,
that. I'm
cool.
working on some things. You know, even regardless of your stage, you still mostly get your books rejected. You know, I write many
Sure.
more than I publish, so who knows what'll come out.
What's the your timing on a book? I mean, you have an idea, you have a light bulb that goes off. Obviously, some of these require it's got to be more difficult to do something historically based, right? Because you got to do some research and try to be historically accurate. Is that more difficult, easier than writing a book about something else?
it They're just different, you know, and
Yeah.
like I feel like doing the research isn't that hard if the information is there, but situations like where I couldn't find anything about Eff's childhood. And
Hmm.
what I
Boy,
didn't
that
mention
yeah.
before was with the kid from Diamond Street, what was missing was details, because when Edith Houghton was interviewed, she was maybe in her late 60s, early 70s, and she'd say, I sure wish she'd asked me 30 years ago. You know, like she couldn't remember the details, but then the Hall of Fame
Oh.
found a diary that had been donated by one of her teammates. And they sent me a copy of it. And so this trip they took to Japan, she wrote about who was getting seasick and who,
Oh,
and
wow.
the way they took shoes from outside people's doors and switched them up as a little like prank on the boat. And, you know, just the kind of detail that
Yeah.
exactly brings something to life, but I had
Hmm.
no access to until this diary came along.
Awesome.
So it depends on, you know, if the resources show up. A funny thing about Doby is I wrote maybe two-thirds of it in 2007.
Oh,
And then
wow.
I know. I mean, I think it must have been right after I'd written F a Manley.
Wow.
And I liked how it was written, but I couldn't commit to one of two different ways to writing it. And I got a little stuck there and I moved on to other things. And in that ensuing time, someone else put out a picture book about Larry Doby. And I was
Oh.
like, well, I lost my opportunities and that's stupid. And then years later, went back to look at the book that was put out. And while it was so meticulously um, accurate and careful, it was historical fiction. It wasn't a biography. It was
Hmm.
about a kid who loved and cheered for Larry Doby. It had stats from
Ah.
games exactly right and everything. The guy did his research beautifully, but it wasn't a biography, you know? And so
Hmm.
there was still a place for it. The editor for
Cool.
this book lives in Montclair, which is where Larry Doby came to live. So she's like, oh yeah, let's do this.
Hmm.
A lot of times, if you haven't heard of the person, like that's what they said about Brothers at Bat, the all brother
Hmm.
team. Like, who's going to buy a book about someone they've never heard of? And you know, there was like, maybe you should fictionalize it. And I was like, I fictionalize it. It could be 57 brothers. You know, like what's amazing is that it really happened, you
It
know, or
really
the brothers
happened.
could be hippopotami. You know, if you're
Yeah.
making it up, what's the point?
Yeah.
And so, yeah. So
Yeah. The
I
fact
was
of
really glad they took a chance.
Edith Houghton's story, the story of the 16 brothers. I mean, the 16 kids in the family, 12 brothers. That it's you can't make this stuff up. That
Exactly.
is real life, and it's just incredible. I mean, I just think it's a fascinating. They're fascinating topics. I hope people. So you started writing when? How long has it been now?
Well, I became a writer in college, so it's been decades. My first
Okay.
children's book came out in 2003, and I've been writing for kids ever since.
And which books have been which stood the test of time so far? What was the first one you wrote?
The first one I wrote was Bark and Tim, the one about a
Okay.
outsider artist and his dog, and it was a tiny little publisher, and you know it was a good way to get a start because a lot of agents or editors want to work with someone who's not new, and it's very hard to get a chance if everyone feels that way. So
Hmm.
publishing with a small publisher gave us an in where
Yeah.
they could say like, oh, she knows,
Oh,
you
wow.
know, it's a very tricky business. But
Yeah.
so I think all my baseball books are all still in print, and like that's saying
Cool.
something because you know they really can go really quickly. Brothers at Bat of them has sold the most copies. It went through Scholastic
Cool.
Book Fairs, if you remember those, and
Cool.
so
Absolutely. Yeah.
it gets sold a lot there. And an inexplicable but hilarious to me fact is that my first novel, which is called Water Balloon, has sold so many copies in Norway that I can't really speak to why. I have no
In
idea, but
Norway.
it sold a lot of copies in Norway. It was
You know,
translated into 5 languages, I think. It's cool.
you that was what something I wanted to ask you too, right? I noticed on there you've got them in a number of languages. Your books, right?
Yeah.
Is that something that you plan on doing? Was that suggested to you? Because I think it's
It's
awesome.
very funny. You're very little in your own control at a certain point. Like I could say no, I'm sure, but so I have an agent, and my agent works with a foreign rights agent, and they go out and they're like, here are the books available, and then they broker the sale. You don't, for me, you don't make that much money on it, but there's something very cool about holding those copies in my hands. I love my
Hmm.
foreign right. I love my foreign copies. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, they've been in more than 15 countries already.
Cool.
So that's, yeah, I love that.
That is awesome.
It's something
Yeah,
I never thought would happen, you know.
it's awesome.
And let's
I think we need to get these out in front of people everywhere because I mean kids books to me I mean they're enjoyable even for adults to read. I mean these types
and
of
I
books are
believe
not
it was
limited to kids, but
that multi-champion James, whatever his last name was, on Jeopardy, who won all those millions of dollars. And they said, "How'd you learn everything?" He said, "I read children's books." A
interesting.
lot of information in a quick way.
Well, like I said, with my wife being a bilingual teacher, so many of the school districts down here, certainly in Houston, have got a big chunk of Spanish-speaking kids. They would love these books to get them, in Spanish and English, both. I mean, I have a bunch of books. All three of my boys are bilingual. They're both.
Oh, that's
As a matter of fact,
fantastic.
my youngest, my five year old is he is in a Spanish-speaking only
Nice.
class right now. So when he comes home, he pretty much speaks English with me and my wife. But when he's at school all day, no, that's it. They're speaking Spanish 100% of the time, which is very very cool. But I like books. We've got a bunch of them that are side by side,
Yeah.
page by page, English, Spanish.
Yep.
I think that's a cool way to do books because
I do too.
even as adults, you can learn. That's how I
Oh,
learn.
absolutely.
I kind of have learned a lot of Spanish on my own, besides just trying to learn it conversationally over the decades. Because I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, but those books have helped me because
Oh, I'm sure.
or
Yeah.
like I know my wife when she first moved here many years ago, she would put on things on television, even like SpongeBob at the time, and have the Spanish subtitles with the English language.
Oh,
So
nice. Yeah.
yeah, and so that's kind of how I try to do it when we watch things. I try to do it the same way just to practice, right? But the
Yeah.
books are great because I could read
Yeah.
to my 5 year old, and in both English and Spanish and know
Yeah.
exactly and learn myself. So I think it's
Yeah.
very very cool. So Audrey, this was great. This was a lot of fun.
It really was. Thank you.
You ought to do a baseball book on. There are a host of Latin baseball players, both male and female, Negro League connection in there. I think there's a lot of material you could pick from if you were going to do another
Here's a
book.
thing we didn't touch on. It's true in all of literature, but it's especially true right now in children's literature that stories that have a Latin root, people really want a Latin author to tell that story. So I
Yeah.
sort of feel like I squeaked by with my Larry Doby. Like I don't know how it happened. You know, the illustrator is a person of color and by rights, and also the
Hmm.
illustrations are amazing, aren't they? What
Yeah.
Kennedy? Oh my gosh, what he did. But so yeah, so I really feel like I don't have access to a lot of the stories anymore to be the
Jonah.
person who tells them.
Jonah Winter said the same thing.
Yeah.
He said, and it's unfortunate because he's been writing for many years,
And he's so
decades,
good.
just
He's
like
so
you guys,
good.
and he's written on subjects
Yeah.
that go to voting rights and about Thurgood Marshall and Barack Obama and Sonia Sotomayor, you name it, right? He's written
Yeah.
all kinds of books on those. I get it. I understand. I feel the same way. When I am putting things out there, I don't ever want to seem like I'm like a carpetbagger. I've actually been doing writing and researching and trying to talk and advocate and tell the stories for a long time. I don't, there are many people I'm sure that come along, you know, in recent, last couple of months to a year that they're new to it. But you guys have been doing this for a long time. I don't know if that.
No, I know. I mean, it's not a clear cut perfect solution, but it's something I sort of feel like I have to respect.
Yeah,
You know?
I get it. I absolutely understand. Yeah.
But
So
yeah, no, I also feel the regret that comes with it, you know?
sure.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of subjects that
That's true.
that are available, and they're, you step on some, I'm sure, all the time, even in your own backyard, like you said,
Right.
with the
With the
brothers. So
brothers.
they're out there, and keep telling the stories. This was a lot
Thank
of
you.
fun. I appreciate your time. This was great, and
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
I will make sure that I keep getting your work out there as well, because I think it's important
Thank
for
you.
kids to see these. So hats off to you. Stay safe.
Thanks.
Uh,
You too. Thanks so much.
all right, be
Take care.
careful. Bye bye.